Go ahead and get started with our second panel. We'll briefly introduce our chair again, Professor Devesh Kapoor, the Star Foundation Professor of South Asian Studies and Director of SAIS's Asia Programs. For those of you who weren't here this morning, as I mentioned, he is also the inaugural, or just named the inaugural chair of the newly established Department of Regional and Comparative Studies here at SAIS. Again, I like to call him the master of the universe. Dr. Kapoor.
Thanks. Thank you all. This morning we were discussing sort of economic issues surrounding the relationship of Korea with ASEAN and India. We know that the global economy is in some turmoil, but I think when we turn to security issues, the turmoil might be even more. So in this panel, we're going to try and get a better understanding of Korean security cooperation with South Asia and Southeast Asia. And we have a wonderful panel. We'll begin with Prashant Parmeswaran, who's a senior editor at The Diplomat based in DC. And his core focus is on Southeast Asian political and security issues. You have his bio in front of you, so I won't go into detail. But he writes quite profusely from whether the Financial Times, Foreign Policy, South China Morning Post. And he'll be focusing more on the Southeast Asia sort of angle. Next speaker will be Josh White, who is Associate Professor of the Practice of South Asia Studies here at SAIS at Johns Hopkins. He's also a fellow at the Rice House Center for East Asian Studies and a non-resident fellow at the Brookings Institution. Prior to coming to SAIS, he served in the White House as Senior Advisor and Director for South Asian Affairs at the National Security Council. And he brings a deep and wide expertise on security issues in South Asia in particular and Asia in general. And then our third speaker is Sir Hyung Jong Kim, who is Associate Professor in the Department of International Relations at Yonsei University. And his expertise is on ASEAN and East Asian regionalism. So without further ado, Prashant. Awesome. Just try and keep your remarks to about 15 minutes each, so we'll have time for discussion.
Sounds good. Okay. Well, thanks a lot to SAIS and to Devesh and team for the invitation. I was just talking to a few individuals before this and saying this is the first time I've gotten an opportunity to talk about this very important topic, which is the security aspect of South Korea's relations with Southeast Asia, which I think doesn't get as much attention in and of itself relative to South Korea's broader regional role. And I think I'll sort of structure my remarks briefly into three parts. I'll sort of talk a little bit about the role of security relations within the broader relationship a little bit. I'll talk about progress for ties so far, and then I'll talk a little bit about prospects moving forward. I think, just as a framing consideration, I think it's a really interesting time to be talking about this topic. We just held we saw the holding of the Seoul Defense Dialogue in South Korea a few weeks ago, and that has been increasingly a platform for South Korea to engage on a number of security issues, including with Southeast Asian states. And that is also an increasingly important calendar item for folks that monitor a lot of regional security dialogues in the Asia Pacific more broadly. We also saw President Moon embark on a major visit to a number of Southeast Asian countries. He is now visited all 10 countries in Southeast Asia. And it's the fastest time any leader has done so worldwide since, I think, Prime Minister Abe back a few years ago, but I may be mistaken on that point. There may have been one or two other leaders that might have gotten that record, but I think it's pretty impressive nonetheless. And I think the third thing I would point out is South Korea and ASEAN and Southeast Asia are in the midst of commemorating the 30th anniversary of the ASEAN-South Korea dialogue, the establishment of the dialogue relationship between ASEAN and South Korea, which was back in 1989. So a lot of action, a lot of focus on the relationship more generally. But I think, as I'll point out in my remarks, traditionally, ASEAN-South Korea cooperation and South Korea's cooperation with Southeast Asia has tended to be economic and diplomatic-led. It's not been security-led. There's been a lot of momentum in terms of trying to increase the focus on security relations. But I think if you look at the sum of South Korea's relations with Southeast Asia, including the Moon administration's policies, you'll actually find comparatively less of a focus on security issues relative to the economic and people-to-people domains. But doesn't mean that there's not a lot of potential for that aspect of the relationship, and that's kind of how I want to structure the remarks today. So South Korea, Southeast Asia security ties, as I said, are pretty modest, but the notable trend is that they've been growing in recent years. If you look at the trajectory of South Korea's relations with Southeast Asia, go back to the Cold War, it was, primarily from the perspective of South Korea's own economic model and the lessons it held for Southeast Asian states. Some of the Southeast Asian countries were big markets in and of itself for South Korea to engage. And also there were these other diplomatic issues that came up, one of which was the competition for diplomatic recognition between North Korea and South Korea that underwent, significant changes in the developing world, and Southeast Asia was one of the fronts in which that played out. The security aspect is much more recent. So when we look at South Korea's engagement with ASEAN, I referred to the establishment of dialogue relations back in 1989. That sort of set the template for a more comprehensive engagement between South Korea and Southeast Asia. And that's been taken a little bit more of a momentum under I would say, the last 3 South Korean administrations. And obviously, the recent Moon administration has taken a lot more engagement and focus on Southeast Asia and taken it to a whole new level. And we've seen that engagement play out in the last few years. I would say if you're thinking about South Korea, Southeast Asia security ties, you want to think about it in probably 3 pathways. One is South Korea's engagement bilaterally with a number of Southeast Asian countries. And there you could point out to increasing momentum on several counts. One is, and this is actually less emphasized. I mean, South Korea, for example, reached a defense cooperation agreement with Brunei formally, actually just last year. And that was a pretty significant development because it showed how a number of Asian powers are not only dealing with the traditional Southeast Asian countries that we think of, like Indonesia or Malaysia, but they're also looking at smaller countries like Brunei and Laos. The second thing I would point to is the fact that if you look at individual Southeast Asian countries, South Korea is actually quietly a major defense partner for these individual countries. If you look at Philippine military modernization, South Korea is a major defense partner, even though the South Korean government may not emphasize it as loudly or as coherently as part of their defense strategy. If you look at where Indonesia is buying its submarines from, it's South Korea, right? So these are things that are quietly happening, even though they don't get a lot of high-profile attention. And then you can look at the ASEAN element of that. There's the ASEAN ROK sort of plan of action that has a number of areas of cooperation. Given ASEAN's bureaucratic nature, these things change from year to year, but there are consistent elements like maritime security, disaster management, cybersecurity, and those things are moving forward as we near the commemorative events between ASEAN and South Korea towards the end of the year. And then you could look at the region-wide sort of cooperation picture. And here, it's a little bit more mixed. Like I said, South Korea has been holding the sort of Seoul Defense Dialogue, and actually within the Seoul Defense Dialogue, you have vice ministerial engagement between South Korea and ASEAN countries, which has been a regular feature. And South Korea has been proposing a number of ideas. One of the ideas that was proposed by the former defense minister just ahead of the Shangri-La Dialogue last year was the establishment of a new maritime security forum for Northeast Asia. And that was actually a comment made in Singapore that generated quite a bit of interest in terms of whether South Korea was willing to play a greater security role in the region. So there's a number of things that South Korea has been doing with respect to security ties. I think the case for greater defense ties between South Korea and Southeast Asia, at least to my mind, some folks may disagree, I think it's pretty clear. So if you look at any defense statement, when you attend a lot of these regional security dialogues, I attended the Seoul Defense Dialogue last year, for example. A lot of the speeches contain 4 key themes that tend to overlap. One is intensifying U.S.-China rivalry and uncertainty about the role that both Washington and Beijing are going to play in the Asian security landscape. Second is the proliferation of transnational threats, terrorism, cyber, climate change, natural disasters. The third is bigger governance and capacity challenges that countries face, including populism, protectionism, so on and so forth. And Southeast Asia is not immune from those. And then the fourth is rising doubts about the rules-based order globally, as well as the Asian security order more specifically. And that includes the ASEAN institutions that I've talked about before. And so if you look at those four trends, I mean, clearly South Korea's strategy of diversifying its partners, including more of a focus on Southeast Asia, and focusing on its own role as a middle power, seems to make sense, right? If you look at, from a Southeast Asian perspective, you're trying to shape a more multipolar world beyond just the United States and China, and you want to engage with each of the actors, not just in their traditional sense, but also looking at them as more comprehensive partners. You would say South Korea is a clear target for that. If you think about South Korea as a traditional sort of economic and people-to-people partner, South Korea, for example, even before Moon came into office, was the second largest trade and investment partner in Southeast Asia, which is huge, something that's often underlooked. You would want, from a Southeast Asian perspective, to engage on South Korea, not just on economic and people-to-people issues, but also on the security dimension. Much like if you talk to Southeast Asians about how they think about the United States, it's always, what you're doing on the security side is great, but we need more on the economic stuff, we need more on people-to-people. So the case is quite clear. But I think the challenges are also quite clear as well. I think perception-wise, South Korea is still not seen as a major security player in Southeast Asia. And actually, a lot of the things that I cited in terms of what South Korea is already doing, a lot of Southeast Asian folks are not actually aware that South Korea is actually doing this. In terms of bandwidth, I think there's greater contestation in both Northeast Asia and Southeast Asia sub-regionally. Whether you look at China, you look at the spat between Japan and South Korea, you look at the nationalism and populist trends in Southeast Asia, a lot of these countries are thinking about what's going on in their own neighborhoods, let alone sort of strategic visions about the Indo-Pacific and so on and so forth. And also, the third thing I would point out is there's a competitive environment that's being shaped here. So South Korea is not the only country that's thinking more about security in Southeast Asia. The Japanese are thinking more about it. The Chinese are thinking a lot more about it. The Russians are thinking more about it. India is thinking much more about it, as I'm sure Josh and others will talk about subsequently. Australia is thinking more about it. The European Union is thinking about it. So it's a much more crowded landscape. And so what each country seeks to do in the security domain will be scrutinized for not just what you're doing, but how do you compare relative to these other powers that are also playing in the region. So where does this all leave us? And I'll kind of conclude on these few points. I think there's things that both South Korea and Southeast Asian countries can do to realize the potential for greater defense ties. I think one basic thing for South Korea to sort of think about is we already have a government in South Korea that's really committed to Southeast Asia. I think what's been missing is where does security and defense ties matter for that aspect of relations? And so that's one thing we have to sort of think about. I think the other big thing is as we deal with these commemorative activities this year, there's a lot of momentum for ASEAN-South Korea relations. So I would say if we don't see security and defense issues discussed between the two sides, that's actually going to be a missed opportunity. I think on the Southeast Asian side, Southeast Asia is not immune from this as well. Next year, you'll have Vietnam that's going to be holding the annually rotating chairmanship of the Association of Southeast Asian Nations. Vietnam is a big security player in its own right, and I know for a fact that, talking with Vietnamese officials, they're really interested in what South Korea and other countries can do more in the region. And so if the Vietnamese can use their opportunity next year in the chairmanship to sort of get South Korea thinking more about what it can do, Brunei, which I mentioned earlier, just signed a defense cooperation agreement with South Korea, is the holder of the ASEAN-South Korea dialogue partnership. And I know this is kind of a very bureaucratic thing, but in ASEAN circles, it actually matters who holds these things and who structures cooperation. That's another opportunity, I think, for ASEAN-South Korea relations. And then I think, I'll just close on this. What niche areas or ways that highlight what South Korea can do in terms of its comparative advantage? I think Japan has been very clever about, repackaging what it's already been doing in Southeast Asia. Frankly, a lot of the stuff is not new. But Japan has something called the Vientiane Vision, which is a separate security vision for how it approaches Southeast Asia, which is new. I could easily see a South Korean government do the same thing. I could see any other governments doing the same thing, just repackaging it and sort of saying, we really want to think about security and geopolitics as a major standalone sort of pillar for our vision for the region. And so that's an opportunity for South Korea to do it. And then, the last point I would raise is, obviously, we're thinking about South Korea and Southeast Asia, but, we all realize that South Korea's got its own issues to deal with, including North Korea. But I think one thing that Southeast Asians will be looking at in the next few years is to see, as South Korea grapples with all these other challenges, including North Korea, is it going to be able to sustain these other regional engagements that it's doing, including on Southeast Asia? So I'll kind of close on that note, and thank you for your time and attention.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Josh?
Terrific. Well, it's really a pleasure to be here, and I think this is a fantastic topic, and I'd love to see events like this at SAIS and elsewhere where we think across some of the traditional divides that have cut up Asia, the study of Asia for a long time. So my charge today is to talk about Korean security cooperation with South Asia. I'm going to take a rather India-centric view of the relationship, the security and defense relationship with Korea, but I think it's an interesting topic for us to explore. Do I have a clicker here? Do I snap? Is there a button? Is it a
Where's the
clap?
clicker?
Clicker somewhere. Okay. You know what? I'll just do this.
Yeah.
Here we go.
Yeah, that works.
It's not quite as exciting as snapping, but it'll work. Oh, look at that. Okay. Perfect. Okay. So I want to begin with a few comments on the strategic frame. I think there are some wider strategic reasons why India and Korea are able to put forward their regional visions, an Act East vision for India and a new Southern policy for Korea, that are broadly complementary. And you've heard some of these already, I think, in the first panel. Both countries benefit, obviously, from deeper economic ties in a moment of macroeconomic and sort of trade turmoil. Both countries gain from at least the appearance of diversifying their partnerships. India has more strategic partners that I can keep track of. It seems to increase almost by the month. But both countries have some incentive to show that they have a diverse array of partners and options. Both countries gain by at least nodding toward the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific, even if there's some reticence to adopt that branding wholesale, it being seen as too American. And both countries can gain from defense technical ties and some modest degree of security cooperation activities, and I'll be touching on that. This is possible because, in part, there are no major irritants in the relationship that would preclude deeper security cooperation. This was not always true, and in fact, even 3 years ago, this was not true. India had, until 2016, rather deep economic engagement with DPRK. I think in 2016, India was exporting about $100 million a year to DPRK. They were importing steel. There were some kind of shady exchanges going on space and other research topics that caught the eye of the 1718 Sanctions Committee. And India was very slow to deal with the perception, I think in Seoul and also in the United States, that it wasn't fully on board with where the international community was on North Korea. And I remember seeing this and working on this a bit when I was at the White House, but in 2016, and certainly when the Trump administration came in 2017, I give the Trump administration credit for making the message very clear on this. It is time to get on board. It is time to play ball, and India made an about face in a way that reduced this issue as a potential irritant in the relationship. They have, at the same time, I think those in Seoul are relatively sympathetic to India's view on Pakistan, on terrorism, and have been at least outwardly complimentary and helpful in supporting India's NSG bid, although behind the scenes the Indians were not thrilled with Korea's NSG chairmanship in 2016. But there is, at least in an outward sense, a commonality of views and no obvious irritants. The flip side of this is that there are no deeply compelling drivers for security cooperation. India has limited security equities in Northeast Asia. I'll talk about some of them. And Korea has limited security equities in the Indian Ocean. So there are not very strong push factors to bring the two countries together, but there aren't irritants. And that creates, I think, some opportunity space to work. So what is the focus of the security relationship, especially in the last few years? One has been to try to define fairly low-risk domains of cooperation. These 4 bullet points here are from a list of topics that Minister of Defense Rajnath Singh mentioned when he was in Korea earlier this month. Rules-based order, fighting terrorism, piracy, proliferation, transnational crimes, you can see it, HADR, cyber, coordinating maritime capacity building. At first, humanitarian assistance and disaster response. Right? At first, I thought that he had actually plagiarized this from a U.S. Defense Department document, because I think that I've basically written those 4 things in that order in DoD and White House documents, which is to say this is a very generic, unobjectionable, widely accepted framework for thinking about activities that on their face seem entirely innocuous, but provide a framework for doing some deeper things together and capacity building, right? And so there's obviously an attempt here, and I think it's a wise attempt to frame an unobjectionable set of domains for cooperation. But what are the actual areas of cooperation? There are 2 that I want to talk about briefly. One is defense sales and technology, and the other is institutionalizing security cooperation ties and security cooperation activities. Let me start with defense sales and technology. Like many stories related to India defense partnerships, there's a good, there's a bad, there's an ugly. There are probably actually many in the bad and ugly category, but just to give you a sampling, it is notable that some things have gone well in Korea-India defense ties. The K9 self-propelled howitzer is a success story. Not every country or industry has a success story in working with India. There's a clear Indian partner. There is R&D cooperation that is expanding beyond the initial work with this platform. And most importantly, this was meeting a felt need by the Indian Army. The Indian Army really needed this equipment. Self-propelled howitzers look like small tanks. They are large guns on wheels or on treads. This was very important for the Indian Army, and so it was a priority procurement, and it has gone relatively well, and it's ongoing. The bad, this has been in the news. There was a deal for 5 fleet support ships, which would help India be able to gradually expand its Navy for blue water capabilities. And this fell through just recently. It's unclear precisely why it fell through, but most of the deals like this that have fallen through because India pressed very hard on technology transfer, on intellectual property, and on the sourcing and supply chain issues to try to indigenize the development work. And then finally, those of you who've been following for about a decade now, this very ugly story of India trying to procure 12 minesweepers. There was a tender that went to a Korean company that was canceled over allegations of the use of defense agents in the procurement. And then there was another tender that went to the Goa shipyards that for which a Korean company was given the sort of advisory deal. That was recently canceled. And now India is putting out a third tender under its sort of indigenous buy and make India framework. This is unfortunately pretty typical for Indian defense procurement. to take a decade, and they're actually so far behind that they had to buy, I think from Australia, this equipment that they drag behind a ship in order to do the minesweeping because they don't actually have minesweepers. Right? So this is not particular to Korea. It is an endemic problem in the defense procurement process in India, but Korea has gotten caught in the thick of it. What's on the horizon? There are a number of big tenders that are coming up in India, and one of the largest is India's attempt to replace about 2,000 of its medium-weight main battle tanks, old T-72s. India's effort to do this indigenously has, crashed and burned is probably literal, has not worked. And so this is one of the major procurements they've opened up to outside players. And they've changed the way they're doing this. They're trying to build a strategic partnership between foreign firms and Indian firms. No one really knows how this is going to work or what it's going to look like, so it's still very ambiguous. But the K2 Black Panther is certainly in the mix for this procurement. More recently, and I think this is notable, when Rajnath Singh was in Korea recently, he laid out a number of proposed sectors for defense technology cooperation, and you can see some of these. Some of them are pretty simple, like certification and quality assurance. Some are more challenging and more sophisticated, but India is trying to build deeper technology partnerships, and I'll talk about this more in a moment. This is not entirely realistic on India's part, and I include this quotation from the defense minister here as our comic relief for this morning, where he was in Korea and he said, "We are progressing toward becoming a manufacturing hub of defense equipment, and investors can use India as a springboard to export defense equipment manufactured in India to various friendly countries." This is utterly unrealistic. India has really failed to create a defense export business, but it is indicative of the fact that India is seeking to attract technology and expertise, and this is something that Korean partners and others can seek to leverage. And I'll say a bit more about defense tech at the end. Security cooperation, what's happening in this space? Well, there's actually quite a lot. Korea and India have a JSOMI-like agreement that dates to 2014. This is an agreement that enables the sharing of classified military information. So this has been on the books for a while. And just this month, they finalized a logistics support agreement. India has been on a roll in signing these. I think this is the fourth or fifth one they have done since they signed the one with the United States in 2016. And I was involved for many years in trying to get the U.S.-India logistics support agreement. And it's actually a very, very simple agreement. It's basically an accounting arrangement that allows ships in the other's territory or domain to swap fuel and do things in a much simpler way. But the challenge has been political. And once India overcame that challenge with the United States, it has begun signing these agreements. These do not obligate either country to certain activities, but they do create a framework for cooperation as countries are doing more exercises. And as you can see, there's been an increased tempo of joint exercises and visits between Korea and India that is rather impressive. Some of these are under the ASEAN ADMM Plus framework. Some of them are bilateral. And the kinds of logistics agreement that they just signed will make this much easier. And really what it does is it allows both countries to practice inching toward blue water, out-of-area operations sort of capabilities, which are very hard. You not only need a ship that can go a long distance, but you need to think about logistics and resupply. You need to think about communications over a long distance. And for India to have a partner like Korea in Northeast Asia to provide options is very helpful. And for Korea to have India as an option coming into the Indian Ocean for an array of possible places to visit is also helpful to build these patterns of cooperation and to build expertise in the navies to do out-of-area sort of activities. Even if they're not doing them together, this is of mutual value to both parties. I want to end by mentioning a few risks and challenges to the deepening security and defense cooperation. The first is each country has to manage partners. India has to manage and navigate some of the Korea-Japan tensions that have arisen and what they see as an uncomfortably close relationship between Korea and China on certain issues. And Korea has to think about navigating the India-Pakistan and India-China tensions. I don't think any of these are particularly difficult because of the distance and the lack of overlap in core security concerns, but they're worth mentioning. The second is that both sides will have a tendency to talk past each other. And I mentioned this because I read some of what Rajnath Singh did when he was in Seoul. And one of his headline speeches in Korea was focused on calls for collective international action to counter terrorism and those who provide sanctuary to terrorists. That's a fairly tone-deaf major speech to give in Korea. It was given and framed for an Indian domestic audience, right? And I think there will be a tendency on both sides to frame the interaction for domestic audiences in ways that maybe is not unhelpful, but is not highly productive. Third, I think both countries will face the challenge of India's endemically bad follow-through, particularly on its Act East agenda. India actually, especially the Indian Navy, is very focused on its West. It's focused on the Middle East. It's focused on the Horn of Africa. And the Indian bureaucracy is so small that it really only pays attention to an issue when its leader, when Modi, or when a very senior figure is involved. So it's difficult to capture and retain the attention of the Indian bureaucracy with partners who might not be at the very sort of top of India's list of bilateral priorities. Fourth, security cooperation is a bit more challenging with another country with whom you don't share common defense platforms. The Korean Army has some, I think they have some old Russian man-pads and some T-80s, but there are very few common platforms. So this is not like India's defense relationship with Vietnam, where they can cooperate based on shared Russian platforms, right? It just creates sort of a different level of distance that they have to overcome for defense security cooperation. Fifth, India's focus on defense indigenization and Make in India and tech transfer makes it hard for players from Korea, Japan, Australia, and the United States to make defense deals that are profitable and appealing, because India is seeking to extract the maximum level of technology, the maximum level of autonomy, and to import as little as possible. And I encountered this when I was part of the Defense Department effort to engage on technology exchange and transfer with India. And the Indian officials would consistently come and say, here's a list of 7 high-tech sensitive widgets that we want. And we'd say, okay, well, let's talk about platforms and capabilities and mission sets and operations. And they'd say, yes, and these 7 widgets that we want are as follows, right? The very strong focus on trying to acquire technology. And the United States faces an extra challenge in that we cannot tell Lockheed or Boeing, you must give that technology to another country. We cannot be as directive. And the final point here is that defense technology cooperation efforts in sectors or with platforms that are not a high priority for the Indian military are not likely to happen. And that is because the Indian military has a large appetite and it has a relatively small and perhaps declining capital budget for actually satiating those demands. And so we've seen this in other cases. The Japanese US-2I amphibious plane has been discussed at high levels, at the leader level for years, and it still doesn't happen because it is not a priority for the Indian military, right? And so if I were to give any advice to my Korean friends who are thinking about technology cooperation, it would be, of course, to target high priority procurements for the Indian system, but also to find ways to get integrated with the Indian supply chain on subcomponents for high priority kinds of platforms. And that is something that I think provides much more opportunity because India is not going to be able to bite off nearly as much as it wants to in terms of defense production over the coming decade or two. So I don't want to end on a down note because I actually think there's a lot of positive momentum, both in terms of defense sales and defense technology, and also security cooperation, which is exciting to see. And both countries have the advantage of not having irritants in the way to really thwart some of this from moving forward. So I will end with that.
Thanks, Josh.
I'm also very pleased to be here, and thank you for the organizer for having me. And I also thank to the previous speakers. Generally, I'm in line with what you have spoke out. And what I'm going to say is about how the ASEAN and Korea can cooperate in field of the securities. After recapturing some historical background of the ASEAN and Korea's the security cooperation, then I'd like to shed highlight on that the possible security cooperation between ASEAN and Korea, with particular reference to the New Southern policies and ongoing the Korean Peninsula peace process and so on. Right. As you know that for the last decade, there's a great tendency toward security cooperation in these regions. And however, the very nature of this mushrooming, the regional security architecture is led us competitive than cooperative. And China's BRIs and then U.S. pivot to Asia and free and open in the Pacific Quad seems to revive the China's U.S. rivalries. And under these circumstances, the middle power countries like like ASEAN and Korea, it seems to are forced to choose the one side unless they share their own security arrangements. And let me say that this is what the ASEAN has achieved so far. So actually, the ASEAN appears to be violent regional grouping by respond to the changing global and the regional security environment, which also led to the changing role of the ASEAN in these regional orders. For example, during the Cold War, ASEAN mainly focused on the confidence building. At the end of the Cold War, ASEAN sought and the inclusive security mechanisms to focus on the cooperative and the comprehensive securities. Probably the best example can be found at the establishment of the ALF in 1994. And now the ASEAN has worked toward ASEAN communities, consisting of the three pillars of the ASEAN political securities and economic and social cultural communities. But now what ASEAN facing now is that intensifying the big powers rivalry in this region, which requires to ASEAN take the new approaches. Right. But if we found that some achievement of the ASEAN, it probably thanks to it's the key element, namely the ASEAN norms. So despite the lack of the consensus on the ASEAN's norms, we can generally agree that what ASEAN norms means. ASEAN norms are characterized by the non-interference principles and the non-use of force in the settlement of the dispute, and the pursuit of the regional autonomies and the practice of the ASEAN way. ASEAN way here refer to that consultation and consensus-based decision-making process. ASEAN norms actually has been enlarged accommodated by the non-ASEAN member state in East Asia. So now this picture shows us that how the ASEAN has evolved in the regional architectures and largely in East Asia. So we can see that despite the lack of the political economic powers, and as the middle and small and middle countries, the grouping, ASEAN has played role, a kind of the leadership role, which based on that the ASEAN norms. So that means that ASEAN has played and provided normative structures for the the related parties. And generally, we can say that non-ASEAN state member countries that largely accommodate the ASEAN norms. But it doesn't necessarily mean that there's no power struggle, but they have to accommodate the power struggles and the power issues, but in ASEAN ways. Along with the institutionalizations, ASEAN centrality has become important issues, but here ASEAN's centrality largely refer to the norm-based leadership rather than the powers and the economic and the political powers. And I think that it appears in a previous session that the chronology of the Korea-ASEAN relations, generally I can say that South Korea has supported the development of the ASEAN, and with the notable event in 1989, the Korea has became the sectoral dialogue partner of the ASEAN. Right. This fact is to show that then how the ASEAN and the Southeast Asian country has evolved in the inter-Korean relations. And unlike the South Korean expectation, actually, the Southeast Asian countries that has managed the equal distance diplomacies with the North and South Korea and so on. So it based also the ASEAN's norm that the neutrality and non-interference principles and so on. So I can say that even the previous dialogue partnership, prior to dialogue partnership, so there was the close interaction between the ASEAN and Korea. But as the Dr. Paramelasaran has rightly corrected out that the South Korea's approaches and the main purpose to the security cooperation in the ASEAN limited that the two elements, but that is the economic benefit, interest. Secondly, mainly about the North Korea and so on. And in not only the bilateral interactions at the regional approaches, South Korea once tried to set up an anti-communist grouping, so-called aspect, but it failed to get the support from the ASEAN member countries because then it was clear that it was seen that the anti-communism is just in contrast with that ASEAN's the basic principle of the neutralities and so on. And also again, in 1981, the General John, who seized the power through the military coup at that time, he tried to get the dialogue partnership of the ASEAN, then which made him to visit the ASEAN countries, but also failed to get support from the ASEAN. There are mainly two regions, the same region. So it was open secret that South Korea's interest to the dialogue partnership of ASEAN was only about the North Korea issues and beside the economic interest. So at that time, South Korea is hardly seen as a considerable partner for economic and the political sense. At the same time, it is not in line with the ASEAN's norm of the neutralities. And since then, also we can see that South Korea's several the foreign policies and regional policies, and which is the often targeted on the Southeast Asian and even wider region of the East Asia and then Central Asia and so on. But we can find that some the commonality that some common trend is that when you have the good relation with North Korea, also we used to have a larger room to deal with other neighboring countries, including Southeast Asia. So here I want to say that North Korea issues has been a very important and independent variable for the South ASEAN and Korea relations and so on, which is still relevant to understanding ASEAN and Korea relations. So here now I'd like to turn to the new Southern policies. As well explained in a previous session by Dr. Kwak, the new Southern policy probably differ from the previous regional policy or the foreign policy of the South Korea, because I think at the first time we declared that value-oriented the diplomacy. So previously, we often revealed that, confessed that the main goal of the diplomacy is the let's say the pragmatic or the sales diplomacy and so on. But it's first time to share somehow normative values with the neighboring countries, and the three P's, the people, peace, and prosperity, is much resemble the three values of the ASEAN communities: the people-centered, people-oriented, and peace, prosperity, and progress, and so on. So these is the things what we can put together, I mean, as a future direction of the ASEAN-Korea's security cooperation and so on. So now, but at the same time, not only for norm sharing and norm forming, the practice are matter for the South Korea and ASEAN cooperation, but at the same time, from a somehow different perspective, we can see that New Southern policy can serve as a strategic means for the South Korea for the balanced diplomacies in dealing with the great powers, the regional strategies, including Indo-Pacific strategies, China's the Belt and Road Initiative, and so on. But what is more important is that ASEAN, the New Southern policy is to reveal that eventual goal of the regional cooperation between ASEAN and Korea. It should simply beyond that somehow one side benefit from the other one. It should focus on that the people-centered, people-oriented, and the peace. And peace here means that we may share that the useful experience of the ASEAN based on the ASEAN norms and so on. So ASEAN here can play as a norm diffusers and norm entrepreneurs, which can provide the normative, the foundation for the regional security cooperation in Northeast Asia, which was not exist before. And I'd like to quote one sentence from the former Secretary General of the ASEAN, Severino. Then he said that traditionally South Korea did not promise much, but delivered on what they did. So here, while we need to be ambitious when we think about the future of the ASEAN and Korea's cooperation, but our plan must be realistic. So here I can draw some challenges in the implementing New Southern policies. So still we very lack of the ASEAN's oriented approaches. So although we put the name of the New Southern policies, we often found that it is just a simple sum of the bilateral approaches. So it doesn't mean that the ASEAN is the equal of the 10 member countries. So we need more comprehensive approach to understand the complexity of the ASEAN and internal ASEAN decision-making process and so on. And norm-based approach is much needed when it comes to the cooperation between ASEAN and Korea, because even it seems to be overshadowed by the power rivalries in this region between the U.S. and China and so on. And one of the things is that when you recall the previous trajectories, we can find that in the heydays of the East Asian community, we also found that there was the very plenty of the good ideas and discussion between ASEAN and Korea to enhance connectivity in many fields. And the newly emerging the issues of the non-traditional security, that is be the great challenge for the ASEAN's Korean security cooperation. So now let me through some the ideas about how the possibly ASEAN's centralities and ASEAN norm-based approach to contribute the peace process of the Korean Peninsula. So let me say that it was suggested, I mean, the last years, and when we had the Korean ASEAN the special summit in the Singapore, and then the president of the Indonesia has proposed that inviting the North Korean leader Kim Jong-un to Korea's ASEAN special summit in Busan this year. So just yesterday, the chief of the Korean intelligence agencies still keep his hope that and the possibility of the North Korean leaders the presence in the upcoming special summit in Busan. So it would be a good opportunity. We knock and tap the opportunity of having the more stable and the complementary dialogue channels beside that existing bilateral and stalemate of the multilateral channels and so on. So, for example, it is quite expected, to have the North Korea as a member of the global societies or the regional society after overcoming some issues, especially denuclearization and so on. So in the case, for North Korea, who are the most trustable and confident partners in this region? That is probably the ASEAN. So North Korea also has shown its interest to be a dialogue partner of the ASEAN. Some of the ASEAN member state leaders also has shown their willingness to accept North Korea as part of the dialogue partners. And so, okay, right. So I'm expect that then if it is realized, to have the North Korean leaders at the Busan for the special summit, then it will be a good opportunity to have the further institutionalization, whether it is the regular or irregular or the formal and informal. It would be good to have the extra dialogue channels beside the existing one. And somehow the possible option when it comes to the norm issues by taking the lessons from the ASEAN's experience, then we can also expect that kind of the multilateralization of the Treaty of the Amity Cooperation, which all the major powers, including North Korea and South Korea, signed before. And also we can expect that some possible East Asian nuclear-free zones, which was signed, which was already done by the ASEAN in 1995. But somehow the ASEAN's nuclear-free weapon zone, somehow we should see that it is still in the progress, because that the protocol of the treaty was not signed by the five nuclear powers. And so in that sense, the ASEAN also has the great need for that expand the nuclear-free zone to East Asia, and while also North and South Korea probably have the better multilateral mechanisms to deal with the denuclearization process even further. Right, so non-traditional security issues, I may skip these issues. And also, I'd like to say that norm still that matters. When it comes to the issue of the ASEAN's the regional strategies, as pointed by the previous speakers, and then ASEAN's outlook on the Indo-Pacific, which very emphasize on the inclusivities and the ASEAN centralities. So without having the ASEAN centrality, without recognizing of the ASEAN norm, it will be very difficult to share the vision for the security cooperation between ASEAN and Korea. So let me conclude that still there are a long way to go. Still is very initial stage of the security cooperation between the ASEAN and Korea. And then I'd like to say that what we need is that ASEAN need to play the much bigger roles in a proactive ways, which ASEAN used to play the very the reactionary ways. But nowadays we need to call the ASEAN to play more actively, especially in dealing with the North Korean issues and so on. And the values of the New Southern policy is not only the issue of what Korea can do for the ASEAN now, but also it should be what we ought to do together. And norm sharing relations between two ASEAN and Korea should enhance interaction in dealing with the political security issues beyond and then comprehensive securities. I may stop here. Thank you.
Yeah, sort of open to the questions. Yes.
So this is for Professor Armstrong.
Can you take the...
Oh, the mic. Yeah, sorry. So you mentioned the transnational threats, and then the last Before you guys came out here, we were talking about increased economic investment in Southeast Asia, South Asia. And up until now, the majority's been in Vietnam and Singapore, where there's not really too many issues of transnational threats. But then it was also talked about how it may increase in places like Indonesia or Malaysia, where there's a significant problem. Do you think South Korea has a role to play in maybe actively participating in counterterrorism operations, or even having joint combined training exercises with their militaries to share lessons learned through participating in the Middle East through Iraqi freedom and other avenues?
Just see if there are any more. Yes, yeah.
So this question is more for Prashant and Professor Kim. I would like to hear your thoughts, given what you've mentioned earlier, saying that given the dynamics with the U.S. and China and the middle power South Korea is, how do you see the relationship between the U.S. and South Korea influence the goal of increased defense ties between South Korea and Southeast Asia?
Yes.
I have a question for Professor White. As you mentioned, India's after 2016, India has been quite active in looking for logistic and maintenance kind of services arrangements.
Can you speak a bit louder?
So I basically want to ask, what is the strategic impetus for India to go for an LSA with South Korea, considering the fact that India has traditionally felt most of its equity on the Western Indian Ocean region? And even though South Korea is not playing a large part, at least in the naval format, in the Western Indian Ocean region. So and India is not traditionally a strong player in the security aspect of Northeastern Asia. So how does it fit in the broader scheme of strategic things for India as such? Thanks.
Why don't we try and address?
So yeah, the good questions. I mean, I think for the first one on transnational threats and challenges and what South Korea's role might be on issues like terrorism and so forth, I definitely think there's a role there, there's potential there. I do think though that it's going to be challenging in terms of how that manifests itself more specifically. I think if you look at the key areas for defense collaboration between South Korea and Southeast Asian states, it's mostly been on areas like logistics cooperation, defense sales, maritime security, a little bit on HADR, but the terrorism front hasn't really been built out. But I do agree. I mean, there's always potential for building it out there. I just kind of haven't seen as much sort of action there relative to the other fronts. On U.S.-South Korea relations and how it affects Southeast Asia and cooperation with South Korea, I think it's a really interesting question. The way I would answer that is that there's kind of two buckets. One is there's a complementarity aspect of that, where for Southeast Asia, there's a recognition that various individual powers play their own role on security, but there's also room for countries working together. So whether it's U.S. alliance cooperation between U.S., South Korea, and other countries, or U.S., South Korea, Japan, Australia coming together on things like maritime security collaboration, I think that would very much be welcome in Southeast Asia. Frankly, to be honest, one of the consequences of the fact that so many major powers are paying attention to Southeast Asia is that there's a whole lot of redundancy in what these countries are doing. So the more these countries can actually think about how to work together, the better. But I think there's also a bucket where there's a lot of concerns about what the United States is doing and what South Korea is doing and how those relate and don't relate. I think there's very poor understanding still in Southeast Asia as to what this whole Indo-Pacific strategy by the United States actually is about. And I think there's actually a lot of waiting to see.
Say that the rest of the world knows what it is?
Yeah, it's a good question too. Exactly, and I think we're talking about this also at a time when we're nearing a U.S. election. I think there's a lot of sort of wait and see in Southeast Asia about what the United States role is going to be after the election, and then I think at the same time, I mean, this administration has done a lot functionally for defense collaboration and strategy, but the president himself, I think, has raised this big question about what the U.S. security role is more broadly. And he's raised that with respect to Southeast Asia, but he's also raised that with respect to South Korea. The U.S. alliance system has been one of the foundational arrangements that Southeast Asian countries have looked for to figure out what U.S. cooperation is going to be. So when we have so many uncertainties about what U.S. South Korea and U.S. Japan alliance cooperation is, I mean, how can Southeast Asian countries that have strategic partnerships and so on and so forth, and even treaty alliances with the U.S. has with Thailand and the Philippines are not as strong nearly as what the U.S. has with South Korea and Japan. I think these countries are also looking to see, what is this U.S. presence going to be 10, 15, 20, 30 years down the line. So.
It's a good question about the LSA. Why bother? I think there are three reasons from the Indian point of view that it makes good sense. The first is that it represents a form of relatively cheap signaling. It's an easy thing to do politically in India now that they got over the tough politics of doing these kind of agreements when they did one with the United States in 2016. It signals that this is, it reinforces the idea that Korea is a special strategic partner of India, so it has that diplomatic value without much cost. Second, it, in a practical way, does facilitate port access by the Indian Navy in Northeast Asia. The Indian Navy doesn't go there frequently, but as it builds out blue water capabilities and builds the skills to do that, it is helpful to have a variety of partners in Northeast Asia that can provide that sort of access. If you look at the countries with whom India has signed an LSA-like agreement since 2016, it's the United States, France, Oman, Singapore, and soon Japan. All of these countries have important, valuable facilities in areas of operation where the Indian Navy might want to actually do things. Right? And the third reason is that I think it, for the Indian military, helps to smooth and facilitate a set of interactions in which the Indians can learn things. The Korean military has experience with counterproliferation, with interdiction operations at sea, things that the Indians are interested in and want to learn from. And even if you do activities that seem more innocuous, planning for disaster relief and so forth, some of those very same activities can be used for counterproliferation and interdiction operations. These are useful things for India as it thinks about its western seas and not just the Western Pacific and sort of its Act East domain.
Dr. Kim?
Right, and there's very important issues about the U.S. influence on the Korea's ASEAN security cooperation. So I think there might be the two issues. One is that when it comes to the choice of the between the China and U.S., certainly it's very difficult issues given the economic dependency on the China's of the ASEAN and Korea too. But also we cannot deny that the great influence of the U.S. security presence in this region. So, but here the difficulty is that we cannot clearly express our the preference, either China or Japan, China or the U.S. So here provide a cost another necessity of the work together between the ASEAN and Korea. ASEAN, thanks to the regional groupings, it doesn't have to show on the individual preference directly to the U.S. or the China. It can hide behind the regional groupings names or the decision. But the Korea, while the Korean doesn't have such the option. So in this case, if the Koreas work together with the ASEAN to discuss the regional issues and then we may expand the strategic option to under the name of the somehow regional affairs rather than the individual countries' interest and so on. Second thing is that then on the process of the Korean Peninsula peace process, U.S. is certainly very direct stakeholder of these issues, but nobody denied that. But what he noticed is that there are the great uncertainties might happen. Even mainly caused by the domestic issues. Not only the United States, but also in Korea, we have experienced over the decade the rise and falls of the opportunities due to the uncertainties of the domestic affairs. So in that case, we need to secure the stable and then safe and trustable the communication channels as much as possible, because we experienced that the totally disconnection of the communication channel between North and South Korea, even 2 years ago. So there was a certain time there's no option but to use the microphone to shout to the North Korea to deliver the message. So it was not joke. And so in the case, the ASEAN's role is certainly there to bridge the North and South Korea together.
Thank you. We have time for a couple more questions. Ambassador.
I want to ask you to Para Meswat. That's how South Korea can contribute to defense and security stability in Southeast Asia. I think the one point you may missed, and that is sometimes in my discussions with the Southeast Asian peoples, is localized dispute on Korean Peninsula. To Southeast Asia, the most fresh point is, of course, South China Sea and Taiwan Strait, and North Korean, the Korean Peninsula issues. That means any of them happen amid the rising tension between the America and China. It could be spread. If anything happened on Peninsula, it could be an impact on the security situation in the South China Sea or Strait, Taiwan Strait. So if we localize that, at least they feel free, they were relieved. If that is not localized by South Koreans or the American, that could be an immediate impact on the South China Sea or Strait. So that, in that sense, they also appreciated our role. That's one thing. And the second one is the defense sale to ASEAN. You mentioned the submarine. That is, if you take just a sale and buying, that is, we think it's a very unique system. You know how we built the 3 submarine. You know how that? Mm-hmm. Actually, 2 built in South Korea, 1 built in Indonesia. What that means built in Indonesia? That is transfer of technology. And any country in the world, to give the military technology is buying and selling is very tough. But South Korea is ready to give it to them, and that modality is well received by Southeast Asian peoples. You know, Southeast Asia now is a maritime issue, and everybody try to naval enforcement. They're trying to build up. So our modality is well received in Southeast Asian countries. And in addition to that, we have the military leadership exchanges with the ASEAN countries, and also it's a low level and high level. That is any ASEAN countries very hesitant to have military or defense sales with China, then America will be not happy. If they buy anything from America, China will be not happy. So in that conjunction, Korea, if it's not well known, if you take like a sell and buy, but actually we do a lot of contributor to their stability, and they are very appreciated our very low-key approaches to their security issues. Thank you.
Thank you. There was one question there. Yes, please. And then you. Oh.
Thanks. I didn't hear a lot of mention of India versus China in the South China Sea, or the East China Sea, or the Yellow Sea. I'm wondering how this factor got overlooked, and how could the Indian Navy, which isn't that great, as Joshua White has indicated, how can they stand up against the Chinese in these disputed waters? And what support are they giving to, might they give to the U.S., say, or Taiwan in those areas? So I wonder if maybe Mr. White and others, Mr. Kim, all of you could comment on that issue. Thank you.
There's one here, and then I can.
Thank you so much. My name is Jie Zhang, and I'm working in the SAIS as a junior researcher. And then my question belongs to Professor Kim. And then while you are presenting your presentation, you mentioned about embracing North Korea through the ASEAN Plus. But I'm just wondering, because given the fact U.S. sanction is going on and effective hugely in North Korea issue, how to which extent we can embrace North Korea as one member of our international society? And then long-termly and or short-termly, could you share your inspirational opinions regarding issue? And then one more thing, except the sanction, but because we have a U.S. election, so if there's some political paradigm shifted, then do you think the Asian countries and South Korea can try together to give us some diplomatic influence on reduce the sanction regarding the North Korea later? So, thank you.
And there's a last question.
So, South Korea arguably is a 30-year-old full democracy. After democratic elections, it's a middling power, as been mentioned, extending its influence. Professor Kim mentioned ASEAN being a norm-based organization. I also think ASEAN is a consensus-based, and I guess Professor Kim is driving at norms in terms of probably external norms, freedom of navigation of the seas, counterterrorism, counter-narcotics. But I'm wondering, Korea as a democracy, and granted, Korea is not like one of the largest champions in UN and other multilateral organizations. I think it picks and chooses its battles and tends to hedge because, of course, it has China as one of its biggest neighbors. But I'm wondering if South Korea, in its growing international influence and its growing activities, whether with India being its own sort of democracy, I wouldn't say it's exactly like the United States, and with ASEAN, which is a mix of democracies and dictatorships, would South Korea in the long term be extending its more like internal political norms? Whether it's, I could easily see anti-corruption being the beginning, but it could run into democratic elections. I know South Korea overseas does provide technology for elections. Will it also go into human rights? And the thing with South Korea being a democracy, I could easily see a change in administrations turning the South Korea government position into more aggressive on North Korean human rights. And how would that South Korean government that's aggressive on North Korean human rights be extending its influence into ASEAN in terms of the whole North Korea question? Thank you.
Thank you. Dr. Kim, would you want to start? And then we'll work.
Right. Thank you for the question. So from the Chang? Yeah. So I think your question, the two questions probably relate to each other. So one is that how we can embrace the North Korea into the international society while the sanctions still remain against North Korea. So I hear that embracing and then guiding North Korea into the international society doesn't necessarily mean directly immediate removal of all kind of the sanction against North Korea. But if you remember that North Korea is still the member of the ARF, so we can use the existing the multilateral the dialogue channels such as the ARF. So we can still has room which is still need to be utilized further to impress North Korea's. So, but the problem is that such as the ARF, while we have such kind of the dialogue channels, but our approach, the use of the dialogue channels probably wrong, was wrong, because that we use it to criticize, we used to use it to isolate North Korea in previous eras. So now we may turn our approach to impress North Korea by utilizing these existing channels and so on. Secondly, is about the sanctions, how sanctions might remain, I mean, over the possible changes of the domestic the politics in the United States. So even nowadays, the South Koreans, the many citizens and then the opinion leaders has argued that South Korea they need to be little active. I mean, by reading some inter-Korea's exchange and then interaction and cooperation in a very practical areas, which is doesn't necessarily be a direct subject of the economic sanctions, such as the Kaesong Industrial Complex and then Kumgang Mountain, then tourism and so on. So there are some rooms which South Korea has to tap the furthest regardless of that then U.S. the economic sanctions imposed on North Korea. So probably I can say that South Korea and ASEAN probably look at some opportunity which can be used at this stage and so on. And second question about the human rights issues, I think that is a very important issues, and also it's related with the norms and the division issues. So as you correctly mentioned that there are some conflicting the norms and among the ASEAN and the related member countries. So my question is that when there are some conflicting situations, probably the issue is that which norms come first. So let's say that the human rights and the democracies and then the peace and the stability in this region and non-interference and so on. So I think given the vulnerabilities and the great fear of the possible conflict or war, I think the priority we can share with ASEAN and Korea, that is make the region the peaceful first. So in that sense, we don't deny that we should work on that somehow the democratic the values and the human rights. But before discussing this, that we need to make this region stable and peaceful. So in that sense, there might be some priorities and then on the peaceful management. In the sense, I mean, the norm not really conflicting each other, but it may come in different orders.
Thank you, because we need to wrap up. Sure. For lunch.
Sure, I'll be brief on the question of the Indian Navy and the Western Pacific. You know, I don't have to be very diplomatic. They wouldn't be able to do much, and in fact, if there were an actual conflict in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, any Indian Navy vessels in the area would be less an asset than a liability, because their supply lines would be extremely vulnerable, and they would be complicated to figure out how to get home and how to stay out of the way. That's not to say they're not useful there. I think they're useful in, it's useful that the Indian government can provide rhetorical and political support to certain countries in ASEAN and countries in Northeast Asia about some of these disputes and about norms. It's useful to have them there to do capacity building in peacetime, to help build up their own capacity and those of ASEAN countries and partners in Northeast Asia. And then they're able to do soft security operations like humanitarian assistance and counter-piracy and so forth outside of a major conflict. But just as India would have trouble in the South China Sea in a conflict, Korea would have trouble in the Bay of Bengal in a conflict, China would have trouble and the same challenges posed to its supply lines if it were in the Indian Ocean, the Bay of Bengal, during a major conflict. It would also be extremely vulnerable in that environment.
I'll just quickly respond. So, Master, I agree with you fully that a lot of the things that South Korea does is quite low level or low key, and so it doesn't often get a lot of the headlines that you mentioned. So, things like intelligence sharing pact with Thailand, or things that South Korea does with Myanmar on administrative reform. Those are really important things, but I don't sense that gets a lot of attention. A lot of the stuff that makes the headlines are things like a lot of attention to the Chinese exercises that they're doing with Southeast Asian countries. That tends to get more of the headlines, so that's a challenge. I would say the other thing that worries me is that there's a lot of talk about what outside powers can do for Southeast Asia, but I'm more worried about how little Southeast Asia is doing for Southeast Asia's sake. The sort of Indo-Pacific vision that we saw from ASEAN that came out was quite thin, quite disappointing. I mean, a decade ago there was conversations in Southeast Asia and ASEAN about ASEAN should do this Indo-Pacific vision. The Indonesian foreign minister talked about it, including here in Washington. No follow-up thereafter, and now ASEAN is left reacting to a vision that the United States and other countries are talking about. So I hope it gets better, but my sense is, leadership in Southeast Asia right now among Indonesia, Malaysia, Philippines is quite lacking. So hopefully that improves, and then we can sort of talk more about what Southeast Asia can do. So.
Thank you. We'll break for lunch and reconvene at 1:30, but please join me in thanking our panelists.